Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first lesson in the AP Environmental Science curriculum. This is going to be lesson 1.1. Before I get started, though, let me kind of explain what you should expect from this. You do have a PowerPoint that coincides with this presentation. I am presenting the exact same PowerPoint. What I'm going to do during this video is go back and forth from seeing me here teaching in front of the classroom to you kind of seeing your PowerPoint in front of you. Some things that might be helpful is with the notes that you will have. Maybe as soon as the slide transitions, you pause it, you copy the notes, and then you listen to the way I describe and I talk about things, so it helps you to maybe understand a little bit better. It's going to be a little bit harder to see the board and the detail associated with the board, but what I'm going to be doing is pointing out different things. Maybe you'll be able to pull and understand those type of descriptors from watching this video. So without further ado, let me get started. Let me kind of explain to you what this is going to look like, and then you'll be able to start learning all about section 1.1, Introduction to Ecosystems. So every one of my PowerPoints is going to start out the same way. I'm going to pull up a page here, and this is from the College Board. This is a document that the College Board put together, and it says what you should know at the end of this course. And what it did is it broke it down by standard. So this is standard 1.1, the Introduction to Ecosystems, and this is what you should be able to do by the end of this. Now, one of the first things you're going to notice is that there are, this is where I'm going to really focus in what's the learning objective. And it's going to start out with a verb. Usually it's going to be explain or describe or something to that effect. Explain means that you need to know in-depth detail versus describe, which is more of a shallower content knowledge. So this lesson is asking us to explain how the availability of resources is going to influence species interactions. So here we go. Now, when we talk about an ecosystem, this is what environmental science really focuses in on. The idea of ecosystems and the way organisms interact within those ecosystems. That is the ecology aspect of this course. We will spend the first couple weeks learning about ecological concepts, and then the course starts to make a big shift. We kind of go, chapter 3 is all about populations. Chapter 4, or unit 4, I should say, is all about more like an earth and space science. And then 5, 6, 7, and 8, and 9 all kind of transfer into more sustainability and problems and different other aspects of the course. So right now we are in the ecology aspect, then we'll end with more of the social sciences and what can you do to increase sustainability. So back to the ecology aspect here. Talking about ecosystems. In ecosystem, by definition, if you remember from biology class, you learned that an ecosystem is all the biotic and abiotic factors in an area. Biotic, all the living factors, and abiotic, all the non-living factors. So biotic, for example, you got your number of trees, your different species of trees. We're also looking at different flora, which is all of your plants, and different fauna, which would be all of your animals. So flora and fauna, those are your biotics. Then you have your abiotic factors, the amount of sunlight, hours of sunlight, the intensity of the sunlight, the relative humidity, the amount of precipitation, the amount of rocks, the amount of all of these different other non-living factors that can influence an ecosystem. Now, when you were in biology, you learned about levels of organization within an organism. You started at the atomic level, and then you went to how does atoms combine together to form molecules, and up to a cell. Spent most of biology talking about cells, and then eventually you get the idea that cells combine to form tissue, tissue combines to form an organ, multiple organs working together to solve a unified problem would be an organ system, and then multiple organ systems all working together in harmony forms an organism. This class, we assume that you know that, and I'm going to go from organism up, or organism to bigger and broader classifications. So if we start at the singular organism, which is an individual of a species, then you have a group of individuals of that species, which is known as a population. So we could be talking about a population of animals, we could be talking about a population of plants, you could talk about a lot of different things. One of the things when we talk about populations we want to make sure we do is we factor in location and time. So you'd be like, oh, the population of the United States in 1850, or the population of eastern white pines in Pennsylvania in 2020. Something like that is how we reference a lot of our populations, because they are year dependent. right? We talk about how things are reproducing, whatnot, especially when we start to talk about endangered species, how populations change. All of that stuff really matters. Now, when you take population or a group of organisms, now you start to take all of the populations of an area, all the living organisms in an area. That is the community. How is the community impacted by global climate change? How is the community impacted by water pollution? All those things are things that we would refer to a community as, all the biotic factors. Eventually, then, when you take the biotic, which is the community, add in all the abiotics, again, the climatic conditions, the earthen conditions, what minerals are there. Now you start to get to an ecosystem. And then finally, the area where all life is found on the planet, bigger and broader than even an ecosystem, is what we refer to as the biosphere. Now, yes, it is a massive area. We're talking the entire surface of the earth and where all life is found. And we go from the deepest depths of life, which we'll be finding our archaea bacteria, down deep into the Earth's crust that are surviving off the heat from the Earth and going through chemosynthesis to generate heat, all the way up to the highest flying organism in the Earth's atmosphere, which is the bar-headed goose. It's not a small bird, but it's a bird that migrates over the Himalayan mountains. So it's really important to understand that, all life is really found from about 20,000 feet above sea level to, I don't know, maybe a couple miles below the Earth, but that's it. It's like the equivalent of like the skin of an apple. That's how thin the amount of life is on the planet. So that's the only spot we have this life found. So what is the major difference between biology and environmental science? And I kind of touched on this already, the idea that you learned about cells, and if you took anatomy and physiology, you probably learned up from cell to organism. And now what we are doing is we are going to the bigger stuff. Now, a lot of people say, why is this different than biology? And biology and environmental science are different. Here's the big thing to understand about biology. Biology is an umbrella term. So all of the life sciences actually fall into biology. Now, if we wanted to be a little bit more specific about what you learned when you learned our Neshaminy bio class, it was probably a lot of microbiology. You learned some evolutionary biology, and then you ended the year learning about a little ecology. When we talk about biology in like at a college or something like that, they have multiple courses. So within that biology department, you will find the environmental science or the ecology department. So environmental science is just a continuation of biology. Again, biology referring to the study of life. Ecology and environmental science is really just how does life interact with ecosystems, and then how those things change over time. So let's talk about how organisms can interact with one another. And there's a couple different types of interactions you can have. One can be detrimental, meaning it's actually going to be negative to the organism. And two can be beneficial, meaning that you're going to gain something from it. So think about that. Anytime an organism interacts, it's either going to be a negative interaction or a positive interaction. Yes, I know what you're saying. Yes, you could have two organisms just kind of walking past each other. That would be a casual encounter, but that's not, really helpful when we're talking about interactions. If you're just kind of encountering something, you're not truly interacting with one another. So let's first start by focusing on the detrimental interactions. When we talk about a detrimental interaction, it is going to either expend energy or cause harm to an organism. So it is going to do something that is going to cause that organism to suffer to some extent. Now, it could be through competition, which there's two different types of competition, intraspecific and interspecific, depending on what type of organisms are in competition. And then there's also predation. So predation would be another example of a detrimental interaction where one organism will die, the prey, and the other organism will benefit, the consumer. But because one of them does die off, we consider that detrimental. Now, what about a beneficial type of interaction? Well, you've probably learned about them again in biology. I know I keep referencing going back to your biology class, but this lesson specifically really does kind of build on that basis that we taught you in biology. Symbiosis. Symbiosis is when two organisms interact and at least one of them has a beneficial interaction to it. And you probably remember most of them: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. I'm going to try to go through a couple more, maybe a little bit more in depth than what you originally learned. So let's first talk about some of the detrimental interactions. A detrimental interaction, specifically one I want to talk about, is going to be predation. In predation, one organism is going to kill another for food. So that is the big thing to understand, is that predation is going to cause one organism to die, and that would be the prey, and then the predator is the one doing the consuming. So what happens is one organism has to go and hunt this other organism. They stalk them. They have different evolutionary advantages to compete or to be able to stalk down this predator or this prey, and then they eventually go and consume it. Well, let's talk about how predator and prey interact, because that's actually really important for us to understand. When we talk about, obviously, one of them is going to perish at the expense or at the benefit of the other. So one dies, one benefits. But there is a lot of relationship between it. If you think about from an evolutionary standpoint, how do predator and prey react and interact? You have one organism that is suffering, but that organism is trying to evolve or is going through different mutations over the population that is going to try to give them an advantage. So they're not the one being attacked. Think of the old adage, if you're out hiking with a group, you don't have to be the fastest person in the group when you see a bear. You just have to be the person that breaks the other person's knee before they break your knee to run away. All right. Remember, you don't have to be the fastest, just can't be the slowest. So I highly recommend being able to break someone's knee if need be. Now, when we talk about predator and prey and how they cycle together, because that's really what happens, the predator population is completely dependent upon the prey population. So in order to support a higher predator population, you must have a very high prey population. And then as the predator population gets really high, the prey population is probably going to go down. And what actually starts to happen is it starts to form this cycling pattern, going back and forth, back and forth. So let's take a look at a way we can actually represent the predator and prey cycling. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump up here. I'm going to sit on my computer so I can kind of make some annotations on this little chart so that you understand. So here we have our predator and prey. Here are your two organisms, rabbits and wolves. Hopefully, you know the difference between the two and you can identify which one's the predator and which one's the prey, but I'll give you a hint. The wolf eats the rabbit. Now, if you look at where we're starting, this starting point, obviously because the populations have already been around and established for a while. We're not really talking about new organisms to an area. If we were talking about new organisms to an area, we'd probably start with one population, and then eventually you're referencing the idea that, maybe a predator will walk into that habitat or prey will walk into that habitat and eventually be able to reproduce and hunt each other. But right now we're looking at a habitat where the populations are already established. So let's go down, and what I want to do is I want to focus in on this point right here. So this is my focus point to start. Now, at this point, we have a lower population of rabbits and an equally low population of wolves. Now, the first thing that's going to happen is because there's a low amount of wolves, the prey species, the rabbits, can reproduce very, very rapidly. So their population is going to grow very, very quickly. So you see the rabbit population shoots way up. Then what you are going to see is a little bit later. So you see a little bit later in the time scale, the wolf population will start to shoot up. Why is the wolf population shooting up a little bit later? Well, now, because all those rabbits have reproduced, now there's a lot of rabbits. So now the wolves are able to eat more. And when they're able to eat more, they're able to survive better. And therefore, they're able to go and reproduce more. So these things are going to happen, and that's going to cause this population to spike at a little bit later recycle. Now, as the wolf population increases, you see that the rabbit population is going to kind of take a turn. They've reached some critical juncture in the relationship between the predator and prey, where the predator is now consuming the prey faster than they can reproduce. Now, because that's happening, the prey population is going to go down. When the prey population goes down, the predator now struggles to survive. The predator doesn't have as much food available to them. It's harder to hunt. So the ones that are best adapted to that are the ones that are going to survive. And what you start to see here is this cycling back and forth of predator and prey. Now, let's talk about a specific example. Snowy owls. In 2014, snowy owl population, or let me at least kind of get a little backstory of snowy owls in our area. Snowy owls are a boreal species. They're found up in the tundra, boreal forests of Canada. During the winters, every now and then they will push down. All right, they push down, they migrate down, not really true migration. But what they're doing is they're moving down because there's more competition for food. In the winters, obviously, it's harder to find food. And you have all the offspring from that summer. So now they're all competing. So they spread out and cover more area. In a normal year, Pennsylvania might see 2 to 3 snowy owl sightings across the whole state, usually in the habitats where they are preferring, which is going to be that open field. So the Lancaster, central Pennsylvania, farm field area usually gets them. Also, usually north central Pennsylvania, especially in some field areas, would get snowy owl sightings. It's not really common down here. We do have records of snowy owls, but it's not like every year you're going to have a chance to see a snowy owl. I guess technically you do have a chance every year, but the likelihood is very, very low. In 2014, there was a bumper year for a prey species called bog lemmings. So this is a bog lemming over here. So this is actually their nest, and it's their nest lined with bog lemmings. So these are all carcasses of the bog lemming, and they would just consume them when they needed them for food. But you can see they have 4 eggs in there. That's usually the average clutch size, between 3 to 5 eggs. Now, in a normal year, they might raise one of those eggs to adulthood. In 2014, pretty much every single chick was raised to adulthood. So their population, instead of increasing by 1 times, or 1 offspring per litter, they now increase by 4 to 5 offspring per litter. Massive, massive population boom. And the reason why there was such that massive population boom, it's because the prey species went through a massive population boom. So what did we see? Well, this chart over here is a frequency of sightings. The darker the color purple, the more sightings they had. And I think the darkest color purple here was something like 50 to 100 sightings of birds. Now, if you look, Pennsylvania is completely covered. We had snowy owls all over Pennsylvania in 2014. Where else did they actually get snowy owls all the way to? All the way down to the Bahamas. Right? Or is this Bermuda? I have to think for a second. I'm all of a sudden spacing out. This is Bermuda. All right. So they had snowy owls all the way down there. Now, that's because they're pushing so far because of such competition between individuals. So they moved south, they found food. And you can see how the prey and population of lemmings and snowy owls go back and forth. Does it look perfect like that chart I originally showed you? No. Does everything ever look perfect like that chart? No. But it's an idea that this is how things kind of cycle back and forth. All right, let's get back to another detrimental type of interaction, competition. I'll tell you this, competition is the one thing that wants to be avoided in all organisms. Why do they want to avoid competition? Because it's an expenditure of energy. Competition is an expenditure of energy that requires them to spend energy for a little gain. Now, there are 2 types of competition, intraspecific competition and interspecific competition. Intraspecific competition is competition within the species, competition for a mate, competition for a specific food resource, competition for maybe nesting sites, something along those lines. Interspecific competition is when you are competing against a different species. So it might be humans and bears competing for salmon as they migrate. It might be wolves and coyotes competing for food off a carcass or something like that. That is interspecific. So intraspecific is when you are competing within your own species. Interspecific is when you're competing against another species. Now, how do we avoid competition? Well, we go through something usually called resource partitioning. Resource partitioning is an evolutionary side effect of niche partitioning. So what you have is you have organisms that are avoiding competition. And the way they're avoiding competition is by becoming more specialized in their niche, their role in that ecosystem. So what they do is they start to find different food sources or narrow in on a specific food source, or maybe a hunting time, or maybe a hunting area, depending on the type of organism and the evolutionary biology behind that organism. So here in this chart, you can see we have a couple different types of resource partitioning. This is one of the standard pictures here. It's a group of warblers. Warblers are migratory songbirds. We get them here, especially out in Idlewood in the spring and fall. They migrate through. Some of them will breed out in Idlewood, but we don't have too many varieties, but there are about 32 warblers that we can get on the East Coast. But what happens is they live up in the boreal forest. So you see this chart, you see, or this image, they're all pine trees. And what it's showing is the predominant feeding areas of these birds. Now, it does not mean that a Blackburnian warbler will never go into the center of the tree. All right. It just means that most of the time when you see this bird, it's foraging on the outer portions and up the upper part of the tree. Now, what has happened is the insects that are up there, that is what the Blackburnian warbler is specialized to hunt. Whereas other species of bird, like the yellow-rumped warbler, will be down lower in the branches of the trees. Now, these aren't like Christmas tree size. These are like 50, 60-foot high trees. But they're showing you the predominant foraging heights of these birds in these ecosystems. Another way to look at it is shorebirds. Different species of shorebirds live in different areas, but the understanding that they're evolved to their specific hunting area or the hunting styles. So depending on the length of the bill, or depending on the biology of the bird itself, will determine where it feeds and what it feeds on. So you might have small plovers looking for small insects high up out of the water, when oyster catchers and avocets can be in the water, because they have longer legs, they're better adapted, longer bills to be able to penetrate deeper into this sand to get whatever they're looking for. So this is the idea of resource partitioning. Now, it's not just where you feed, it's also maybe how you feed. Talk about temporal resource partitioning. Owls and hawks eat the same thing, but they hunt at completely different times of day. So they've evolved to have different characteristics that benefit them so they avoid competition. Remember, when you compete, you're expending energy. And when you expend energy, that is not beneficial to you, your survival in the long run. So you want to avoid competition at all costs. So here, let's start talking again about intraspecific, specifically talking about the idea of competing within a species. So here we have bighorn sheep, which will go through a mating ritual to see who's pretty much the alpha to determine who's breeding. And then you have some giraffes fighting here because I had to throw giraffes fighting into a PowerPoint. But the idea of, maybe blue jays fighting over acorns or grizzly bears fighting over salmon, bullfrogs fighting for a mate, that's all intraspecific competition. Now, is this good from an evolutionary standpoint? Absolutely. What you're identifying is those that are best adapted to their ecosystem, those that are the alpha, those that are the fittest for reproduction. And if you know the old adage about evolution, it is survival of the fittest. Now, compare that to interspecific competition. In interspecific competition, you have two species competing for a limited resource. That's the big thing to understand. It's a limited resource. If it was an overly abundant resource, we would not have as much competition because then any organism could just go out and get it. But we are talking about ecosystems that have great biodiversity and that have very specialized niches, and therefore organisms are best adapted to their specific niche. One of the most famous types of interspecies interactions is the symbiotic relationships. So the symbiotic relationships are a group of interactions depending on three different characteristics you could have. Depending on your interaction, you could benefit, you could have a neutral or a null interaction, which means you don't benefit but you're not harmed, or you could have a negative interaction. During those three different types of interactions, you are going to have some sort of result. Now, depending on what organism 1 does and what organism 2, who could have one of those three results as well, you can kind of plot out different types of reactions. And that's what I've kind of done here. Now, I've used this chart and it helps me to kind of understand it a little bit better. Hopefully it benefits you. But here's what you have. You have two individuals. So you're up here, I have individual B, and over here I have individual A. Now, we have three different categories for each one. You could be positive, neutral, or null interaction. I'm sorry. Positive, neutral, null, or negative interaction. And then the other organism, individual A, could go through a positive interaction, a neutral or a null interaction, and a negative interaction. So depending on where you fall, positive, and you can read a chart, hopefully, if you are positive and neutral, where do you fall? Now, three of these are repeats, so I just kind of left them off. But if we look at this, you can kind of see how different organisms interact. If it's positive, it's going to be mutualism. If it's positive, neutral, it's going to be commensalism. If it's positive, negative, that will be predation if they die. If they don't die, that's going to be parasitism. Right? Then if it's 0-0, that neutral, that's that casual encounter I referenced earlier in this PowerPoint. Now, this is an interesting one. You probably never learned about it before, but neutral and negative would be amensalism. And that's kind of like, we're going to go through some examples in a second, but an organism that doesn't really realize it's causing harm to another organism. And then finally, negative, and that goes back to that competition, that expenditure of energy, which does not benefit any organism. It benefits the population from an evolutionary standpoint, but it doesn't benefit the organisms at the time. So let's go through mutualism real quick. Mutualism is an interaction where both organisms are going to benefit. So what are some examples? How about ants and acacia trees? Acacia trees produce a sweet, sugary sap called honeydew, and the ants eat that honeydew. So the ants benefit from getting a food source. The acacia tree benefits because it also provides housing for the ants, so the ants live within the tree, but the ants will defend the tree against predators, so things like caterpillars or beetles that come in and try to eat the leaves of the tree. The ants will all attack it because the ants look at that tree as their food source, and then they defend it. So the tree benefits from getting defended, or a defense system pretty much installed on it, and the ants benefit from getting food. Another example, bees and flowers. Bees go to flowers to get the nectar, sugary solution. It's about 20 to 25% sugar. Right? So think about sugar water. 1/5 sugar is nectar. Now, the bees get food that benefits them. The flowers benefit because when the bees go in there, they pick up pollen and they aid in reproduction. So bees are pretty much the method or the vector of reproduction for flowers. So flowers benefit because now they're able to reproduce. And finally, we get squirrels and oak trees. Squirrels benefit because they get to eat the acorns. They also get to live up in the trees. The oak trees benefit because squirrels are pretty dumb. And squirrels will go and bury all of their seeds or those acorns throughout the year or through the winter time or through fall into the winter, and they forget where they put them. There's studies that show that squirrels only really remember where they put about 7 to 10% of the seeds they bury. So for the most part, they forget where to put things. Commensalism. Commensalism, one organism is going to benefit, the other organism is going to have a neutral or a negative, or a neutral or a null interaction. I'm sorry, I keep saying negative, just the letter N is just kind of running with me today. What you have here in this example, this first one, is a cattle egret, and it's with some big herbivorous grazers. This looks like a Cape buffalo. But what you have is the way a herd of Cape buffalo will walk through a grass field. And in walking through the fields, they flush or kick up like grasshoppers or small insects or small amphibians or small reptiles. And the cattle egrets just kind of walk along, and now it's pretty much like creating a buffet for them. So the cattle egrets benefit from getting easier food, whereas the Cape buffalo or the large herbivorous grazers, whatever they may be, they don't really benefit at all, but they're not harmed at all because they're not eating that food. So it's this interaction they have where it's kind of like, all right, you can hang out with me, and you can eat that food, but I'm just going to keep doing my thing over here. Another example, which is probably very famous for a lot of you, is the old clownfish or Nemo, and the way it interacts with the sea anemone. Sea anemones have specialized cells called nematocysts, which shoot off and inject a venom into an organism. It's all cnidarians, which is a family of aquatic organisms, like jellyfish. It's kind of fall in the same category. But the clownfish is immune to the venom of the sea anemone. So the clownfish is able to benefit from having a place to hide and shelter, and the sea anemone isn't hurt, and they're not benefited in any way. Parasitism. Parasitism is always an interesting topic to talk about because people think it's really gross, but it's an evolutionary advancement. So it's a way organisms have learned to survive. And what's going to happen is that you're going to have two organisms. One is going to benefit and one is going to be harmed. The one that benefits is called the parasite. The one that is harmed is called the host. So let's take a look at a couple examples of parasitism in action. Things like ticks. Everyone's probably had a tick on them, or at least knows somebody that's had a tick on them. What a tick will do is it will crawl onto you, it will bury in, it will suck your blood until it fully engorges itself, and then it will disconnect, fall off as a big, pretty much like the size of a raisin now, and it will then bury itself underground and survive for the rest of the year. That's how ticks work, right? The tick benefits, the organism is harmed. And especially now we talk about different diseases that can be transmitted from ticks. That's not truly the symbiotic relationship, but it's an understanding that something else that's bad associated with it. Tapeworms and other flatworms, and the idea of how these organisms interact. What happens is you ingest small worms or eggs of worms, they hatch, they live in your intestines, and what they do is they feed on incoming food. So when you eat, what they're actually doing is they're ingesting that food. Now, the thing is, tapeworms don't want to kill off their host. If worms or any parasite kills off their host, then it no longer is able to provide them a benefit. But what will happen with tapeworms is then they will eventually just lay eggs, and they just kind of go out through the digestive tract of different organisms. So if your dog's ever had worms, or your cat's ever had worms, or you have any other pets, they could get worms in them. Humans can get worms depending on different types of foods you eat. So that's why they tell you to cook certain foods, like pork, for example, must always be cooked to a certain temperature. You don't ever hear about people eating raw pork for that reason, is that pork can oftentimes contain worms inside of it, so you want to make sure you cook it all the way. But I want you to think of not necessarily things that harm humans all the time, but what about something else? How about the brown-headed cowbird? Brown-headed cowbird, very, very common bird in our area. What it does is it doesn't raise its own eggs. What it does is it parasitizes a nest of another organism. So what it will do is it will find a nest where eggs are laid. It will sneak in. It will lay its egg inside. So if you look here, this picture, you see these probably robin's eggs here, these blue ones, and then this one brown and white speckled cowbird egg. And what will happen then is the robins will come back to the nest. They will incubate it, and they will eventually raise this cowbird to an adulthood. And it actually is very detrimental to the host parents because they now have to expend a lot of energy getting more and more food, whereas the cowbirds, benefits as a population because they have other organisms raising their food. Let's talk about amensalism. It's the last symbiotic relationship, and then we're almost done for this lesson. In an amensalistic relationship, you have one organism that really experiences a neutral interaction, and the other organism experiences a negative interaction. So how does that work? Well, think of like an elephant walking through a field. All right, maybe you have ants that are building an anthill, or termites building a termite colony, and the elephant just steps on it. Does the elephant know that he stepped on it? No. Do the ants know that an elephant stepped on them? You better believe it. All right, so that's an example of amensalism. Another one would be like beavers. Beavers, in order for them to build their habitat, what they do is they will take a small stream, they dam it off. So those of you that don't know much about beavers, let me quickly explain. You have a small stream. It's going to get dammed off, which then floods an area. And then beavers build a lodge within that flooded area. Why do they flood the area? Because it protects them. So it protects them from predators and different things like that. It creates their habitat for what they need. Finally, let me go and recap this first lesson. I know this has been a long lesson. I promise you, they're not all this long, but there will be some that are this long. Quickly go over it. Do you understand the levels of organization? Do you understand from biology up to cell? And then do you understand cells combine eventually to form organisms? All right, I'm skipping a couple steps there, but let's start with the organism. Organisms of the same species together, that's a population. All the populations in an area that is a community. Take in the abiotic factors now, factoring in the amount of sunlight, weather conditions, all sorts of other stuff. Now you have an ecosystem. The area where all life is found on the planet is your biosphere. Do you know that? Fantastic. Do you know the different types of organismal interactions? Do you know there's some beneficial, some detrimental? Do you understand which ones are detrimental or negative to an organism? Do you understand which ones are beneficial to an organism? If you do, fantastic. That means you've got everything we need to know. That means if we were to go back to that second slide where the College Board tells us what you need to know, you should be able to understand that. Do you understand that there are limited resources that organisms must achieve or must gather in order to survive and reproduce? Fantastic. And if that works for you, and if this lesson worked for you, I think I just did my job. And I look forward to seeing you at the next lesson. Thanks for checking in.
You like that lesson? I know you did. So why don't you go ahead and smash that like button right now. Go ahead and comment. Tell all your friends about how great that lesson was. And make sure you subscribe, because I'm going to keep bringing you AP environmental content that you're going to want to watch. Or do whatever else those other YouTube channels tell you to do. And with that, Maloney, out.